Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom, welcome back to today's Daf, which is Eruvin Daf Mem Vav. We have 5 lines from the top of the Amud. The Mishnah presented us with a machlekes between Rabbi Yechim and Nuri, who holds that even a person who is asleep during Ben Hashmashes is koine shvisa. He acquires a tchum, he can walk 2,000 am in all directions. In contrast to the Chachamim who hold, only a person who is awake and aware during Ben Hashmashes, he gets shvisa. Otherwise, he's limited to merely his personal space of 4 amas. Says the Gemara 5 lines from the top, Amar Rabbi Yaakov Aridi, Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Halacha Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri. The halacha follows Rabbi Yechon's shita that a person, even when he's asleep during Ben Hashmashes, will be koine shvisa. Amalei Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Yaakov Aridi. You're quoting Rabbi Shua ben Levi that the halacha follows Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri. Befeirosh shmialach, have you heard it explicitly that Rabbi Shua ben Levi concluded as such that the halacha follows Rabbi Yechonon? Or perhaps it was only implicit, something which you've derived from another statement of Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Amarle, so Rabbi Yaakov responded, Befeirosh shmiali, I personally heard this. He said it clearly that the halacha follows Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri. Says in my klala, what would have been the other statement, a more general statement that Rabbi Shua ben Levi said, that perhaps Rabbi Yaakov would have derived from there and come to this conclusion? My klala, D'Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, halacha kedivrei hamekel be'erev. Because Rabbi Shua ben Levi said once that when it comes to Erev, we follow the lenient shita. As Rashi points out, that tchum is also within the context, within the halachas of Eruvin, and therefore we're meant to follow the lenient approach, which is Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri in this case, who holds that even a person when he's asleep will be koine shvisa. So that was his question. Was it from that statement, that general statement, that you have derived this conclusion? That Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri is the shita meant to follow? Or perhaps was it something more clear? And he answered yes, I actually heard it clearly. Rabbi Shua ben Levi said that halacha follows Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri. Says more Tarti Lamali. If that's the case, why both statements? Why did Rabbi Shua ben Levi need to issue both? Number one, that when it comes to Erev, we follow the lenient view. And number two, that we follow Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri. It seems to be a repetition here. Amar Abzeret Tzrichi, both statements are required. Why? Because had he only said halacha follows Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri, Hava Mina, I would say bein lekula ubein lechumra. Let's keep in mind, Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri taught us 2 things. Number one, a person who is asleep will be koine shvisa, so he's not limited to merely 4 amas. He gets 2,000 all directions, and that is a kula. But he also said that a chayfetz of hefker will get shvisa. That shvisa and tchum can be applied even to an ownerless object. So that actually results in a chumrah. Because according to the Chachamim, that a chayfetz of hefker does not have shvisa, what happens? Anybody who picks it up could just take it along with him. Whichever direction he's allowed to go, the object is not limited to within this radius of 2,000 am. So in this case, Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri, who applies tchum even to a chayfetz of hefker, is actually teaching us a chumrah. So had Rabbi Shua ben Levi only said that halacha follows Rabbi Yechonon, blank statement, I would say, well, in both applications, when it comes to a person, he gets shvisa, and that's a kula. It's not limited to 4 amas. He can walk for 2,000, and also it's applied to a chayfetz of hefker, in which case it results in a chumrah. He's not unlimited. He can't just be taken around. He's limited to his tchum of 2,000. Kamashmal, and that's why Rabbi Shua ben Levi need to add halacha kedivrei hamekel be'erev. And when it comes to Erev, we follow the lenient view. That indicates to us that we only follow Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri when it comes to a kula, meaning an adam. But when it comes to kalim, in that case, we don't follow Rabbi Yechonon, because that will result in a chumrah. Rather, in that, we follow the Rabbanon, that a chayfetz of hefker does not have shvisa. So that's why he needs to add that when it comes to Eruv, we follow the halacha k'divrei hamekel. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, why couldn't he just suffice with that statement? V'leim halacha k'divrei hamekel be'eruv. If he would have just said that, then we would conclude as such. We would say, well, when it comes to Adam, we follow Rabbi Yochanan. When it comes to Kalim, we follow the Rabban. It's meant to result in a kula on all sides. Halacha ki Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri lamli. Why did he need to add the other statement as well? Halacha follows Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Says more Itzrich, that too is needed. Saka daitach amina. Perhaps I would say, if he would only issue the first statement, Halacha k'divrei hamekel be'eruv, I would say, well, we follow the lenient shita only in certain cases. Hanimila, that's only said yachid makam yachid. If the individual is opposed by another individual, so machlekes between two individuals, or v'ravim makam rabim. If we have a multitude opposed by another multitude, avol yachid makam rabim. But let's say you have a yachid who's being opposed by a majority. In that case, perhaps emaloi, I wouldn't follow the individual, the yachid, because he's being opposed by a rabbin. I meant to follow the rabbin. So even when we're speaking about Eruv, and the yachid is the mekel, perhaps we won't say the halacha follows the yachid. We meant to follow the rabbin in that case. That's why Rabbi Shimon Levi saw a need to stress, to issue that second statement, halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, which teaches us that we follow Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan's lenient shita, meaning by Adam, even in face of a rabbin, such as this case where the rabbin, the rabbanon, disagree with him. And that's the chiddush here. So both statements are needed. Had he only have said Hadlach Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, I would say, well, whether the chumrah or the kula, by Adam, which is a kula, and by Kalim, which is a chumrah, we follow his shita. That's why you need to say halacha k'divrei hamekel be'eruv. We only follow the lenient view. Had he only said that statement, I would say, well, that doesn't include our case because Rabbi Yochanan is being opposed by a rabbin. So meant to favor the majority. Therefore, he needs to teach us. No, halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, which is coming to include even this case. Let's take a look at Rashi, 8 lines from the top. So he said halacha k'divrei hamekel be'eruv. Says Rashi be'eruv b'chol mishpatav. In all its halachas, all its applications. Utchumen, the halachas of Tchumen, Maseches Eruvin is also considered to be part of Hilchas Eruv. So, had he only said halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, we would say bein lekula, whether it has a lenient application, it could go in Adam Yashin, a sleeping person. In that case, it's a kula. Why? The Eloi kana shvisa, because if he hasn't acquired shvisa, what happens? Like nafik medal damis, he must remain within his 4 amas. So, when we follow Rabbi Yochanan, it results in a kula. L'chumra, on the other side of the coin, we would have a stringency. Kigoin klei hefker. If you have a kli which is hefker, I amas koin shvisa. If you follow Rabbi Yochanan, and shvisa applies to a hefker, asalei lichan l'makim sh'irav zehamoitzan. They can't be moved around. They can't be taken in the direction where this person can go. So let's say he can go 4,000 amma to the east because he placed an erev tchumen. If this chayfetz, which is lying right here, has its own independent din shvisa, it can only be transferred within this radius of 2,000 from the kli. It can't be taken over to the location where this person's heading. Ela alpayim with islu l'chol ruach only has 2,000 direction. So perhaps we would follow Rabbi Yochanan on both accounts. Kamash malon. Therefore, he teaches us kedivrei hamekel. We only follow the divrei hamekel ba'adam who the Hilchos Kavah say. It's only when it comes to Adam we follow Rabbi Yochanan. The kivan, the near kana yashin namin kana. Rashi is going to explain for us how can we split the two things. So Rashi and also Tosfos points that out. How can we split? We could say, well, when it comes to Adam, we follow Rabbi Yochanan Shita. When it comes to Kalim, we do not. It appears that they're both really interconnected. Rabbi Yochanan says awareness is not a requirement for Kinyan Shvisa. Therefore, a sleeping person, or even a chayvetz of hefker, is Kinyan Shvisa. Now, how can we split the two and say, well, we only follow Divrei HaMekel, meaning, when it comes to Adam, which results in a kula because we're lifting that restriction of 4 amas, we're giving him tchum, we follow Rabbi Yochanan. Even if he's lacking awareness, it's okay. When it comes to a kli, we say, no, we don't want to impose restrictions and give it its tchum. We want to leave it unrestricted and anybody can walk away with it. In that case, we don't follow Rabbi Yochanan, either or. How can we split the two things? As Rashi says, because there's a svar to say that Adam is different than a kli. This was the svar mentioned in the Gemara earlier, actually. The kiva denir kana yashin nami kana. Since a person, if he would be awake, be aware during the Neshmashe, certainly there were no questions that he's kind of a tchum. So since he's still a bar shvisa, he's a bar das, he's a person. If he'd be awake, he'll be okay. So if he's sleeping, it's also fine. He's a person that has the ability to acquire shvisa. In addition to that, the presumption is that he wants, is a consenter, he wants the shvisa. Therefore, when it comes to a person, he gets shvisa, even if he's asleep. Aval b'kelim less hilchok avasei. But when it comes to a kli, we don't follow Rabbi Yochanan. Just an inanimate object won't be kind of shvisa. So that's why you need to add this. You need to say it's only when it comes to the kula that we follow the shita. So why can't he just suffice with that? Asked the Gemara. He could just say halacha divrei mekel be'erev, and we figure this all out on our own. He needed to add that we follow Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Because perhaps I would say this is different because it's avol yachad makim rabim kigon Rabbi Yochanan menuri the plig rabban alei. This is a case where a yachad is being opposed by a rabbin. Ema, perhaps I would say less hilchos kavasei. Halacha does not follow his opinion. That's why he needed to tell us, even in this case, we follow Rabbi Yochanan menuri's shita. Continues the Gemara. Amalei Rav Abaye. So Rabbi Shimon Levi needed to stress that we follow Rabbi Yochanan menuri's shita. An Adam who is sleeping is kind of shvisa. Perhaps I would say we're going to follow the Rabbim. Now, we're speaking about a din de Rabbanan. Tchumen, it's a Rabbanan. Why did Rabbi Shimon Levi see a need to stress that? Perhaps I would say we follow the Rabbim, and therefore we need to stress we follow Rabbi Yochanan Nuri, despite the fact that he's merely a Yachid connected Rabbim. If we're speaking about a din de Rabbanan, we know that Safek de Rabbanan lekula. So whenever you have an uncertainty, we follow the lenient approach. So what difference would it make if there's a Rabbim against him or a Yachid against him? We would follow the kula regardless. Amali Rav Abaye. Mechti, let's take a look. Eruvin Rabbanan. It's a din Rabbanan. Mali Yachid b'makim Yachid. What difference does it make if it's an individual who is having a machlekes with another Yachid? Umali Yachid makim Rabbim. Or it's a Yachid who is being mekel and being opposed by a Rabbim. In either case, it's Safek de Rabbanan. So even if you have many people against him, it's still a Safek. We would follow the lenient view, which in this case is the Yachid, regardless. So there's really no need for Rabbi Shimon Levi to have to point that out to us. That's not the case. I'll prove it to you that even when it comes to the Rabbanan, where we say Safek de Rabbanan lekula, but when there's an overwhelming factor on the other side, for instance, there's a Rabbim, there's a multitude, a majority who oppose the Yachid, that carries weight. That's an indicator that perhaps their view is the correct approach. And therefore, when it comes to the Rabbanan, perhaps we would follow the Rabbim. And that's why Rabbi Shimon Levi needed to stress, no, in this case we're going to follow the Yachid. Even when it comes to Rabban, don't you think there's a difference? Ben Yachid makim Yachid, when there's a Yachid who has a lenient view, and he's only being opposed by another individual, between that and Liyachid makim Rabbim, or when there's a Yachid who's mekel, but he's being opposed by a Rabbim, you don't think there's a difference between the two things? It certainly is. Vatnan, we've learned in the Mishnah as follows. Rav Eliezer Omer, Kol isha she'avro leha shalish einos dayashata. The Mishnah in the beginning of Maseches Nida tells us that if an isha sees dam, so in our Torah she's tamei going forward. Midrabanan there's a gzera of me'es leis. We're concerned perhaps the dam had already exited the inner cavity, came to the bayis hachitzin, in which case she's tamei, and that happened without her realizing it. Therefore, Rabbanan said, when it comes to truma, to kachim, we consider her to be tamei retroactively, 24 hours retroactively. So anything that she touched from truma or kachim, we consider tamei. Now, let's say an isha is already a zakena, elderly woman, and she has stopped seeing dam. She had ceased for a period of shalish einos, 3 cycles, 3 periods, which is a total of 90 days. So, at that point we say, well, she's not really prone to seeing dam, and even if she happens to see some dam, she's tummy only going forward. We don't say, well, perhaps she was already tummy within the last 24 hours. But that's specific to an Isha Zikena, a mature elderly woman. Rabbi Lezer says this applies to any type of Isha, even a young woman. Kol Isha, Shavar Aleh Shalish Oinais, who had passed through 3 periods, meaning a total of 90 days without sighting any dam, Daya Sha'ata. If she'll see dam, we say it's enough to be Metamaha Sha'ata, from this time on, from this moment forward, but not retroactive. Now what happens if this takes place, a young Isha didn't have dam for 90 days, and now she has dam. According to Rabbi Lezer, whatever she touched within the last 24 hours is tar. According to Rabban, it's tummy. So what happened here? V'tanya, we have a story, Maseches Eruvin Rabbi Lezer. There was a story with an Isha who had this experience, and there was some truma that she touched, or some kachum that she touched, whatever it is she touched within the last 24 hours. And the Shaila came to Rebbe. What should we do? So Rebbe did like Rabbi Lezer. V'asa Rebbe Rabbi Lezer, meaning he considered it to be tar during that retroactive period. After Rebbe recalled that he erred, Omar, he said, I'm going to leave the ruling as is. I'm not going to overturn it. Omar Kedayu Rabbi Lezer lismach alav b'shas adchak. Rabbi Lezer is great enough to rely on him in this time of need. Rashi says it was a time of famine. Taisa says that the person who asked the question perhaps left town. So it was a time of necessity. So he stuck with the shita, with the halacha, and he considered anything that was touched within the last 24 hours by this Isha as tahar. Okay, that was the end of the story. Let's analyze. What does the Brisa mean? Ma'ila achash niskar. After he reminded himself. Well, what was it that he recalled? Perhaps he remembered that halacha concluded like the Rabbanan, not like Rabbi Lezer. We paskin like the Rabbanan. That's what he reminded himself of. If that's the case, how could he stick to the ruling? B'shas adchak, hechi avid kavasei, even if it's a shas adchak. It's a time of need. It's a pressing time. How could he follow Rabbi Lezer? If the halacha concludes clearly like the Rabbanan, it's tamei. Ella, delay itmar hilchas like Rabbi Lezer like Rabbanan. Apparently, there was really no conclusion as to which shita went to follow. So it was left unresolved. So what then did Rebbe recall? La'achash niskar. The lav yachid palagale. He recalled that it's not a yachid who's disputing Rabbi Lezer. Ela Ravim pligale. It's actually a Ravim who disagree with him, who hold that the Isha in this case would be tamei lemafreya retroactively. So that's what he remembered. It wasn't that he remembered that halachically speaking he did something wrong, but he did remember that. Let's keep in mind there's a Ravim, a majority who disagrees with Rabbi Lezer. So perhaps that leads us to conclude that we're meant to follow the shita of the Ravim. Now, even though it's a Rabbanan, but a Ravim carries weight. That's a true indicator, perhaps, of the credibility of their shita, of their opinion. Omar, nevertheless, he said, despite that, he said, Kedayu Rabbi Lezer, lismach alav b'shas adchak. Rabbi Lezer is great enough. One can rely on him in this time of necessity. Let's take a look at Rashi. On the right on the right, beginning with the word Ella. Ella Dr. Rashi, Hai lo yahader. Why didn't he revert? Because indeed there was really no conclusion as to which shitu meant to follow. Not like Rabbi Lezer, nor like the Rabban. Umay niskar. So, what did he recall? La'achash niskar. The Ravim pligale. He remembered that there's a Ravim that disagree with him. The Havel Elamevet Kiravim. And therefore he's meant to follow the Ravim. So that's what he recalled. So he stopped for a moment and he said, no, I'm going to leave it as is. Amar Kedayu Rabbi Lezer, Lismach alav b'shas adchak. I can rely on Rabbi Lezer. And he didn't overturn the verdict. Ha la b'shas adchak loy. So this indicates to us that if it wouldn't have been a time of necessity, if he wouldn't have had that mitigating factor, loy, he wouldn't have kept to this halacha. He would have followed the Ravim. Alma, apparently, Alfagav. The Meisel is Gzeir de Rabban. Even though we're speaking about this retroactive tumah, which is certainly only exerted Rabbanon, and when it comes to the Rabbanon, we should follow the lenient approach. One is meant to follow the Rabbim because they carry weight. They're an indicator of which way to go. So this was Rav Papa responding to Rav. You're surprised why Rabbi Shimon ben Levi saw a need to go ahead and teach us explicitly that we follow Rabbi Yechim and Nuri, despite the fact that there's a Rabbim opposing him, because otherwise perhaps I would follow the Rabbim, even though it's only the Rabbanon. You're wondering why I need to do that. I proved to you from this whole story, from Rebbe, that even when it comes to the Rabbanon, generally we're meant to follow the Rabbim. We're meant to follow in that direction because the fact that there's a multitude that maintain that opinion, that's an indicator about the weight and the credibility of that view. So even when it comes to the Rabbanon, we want to follow the Rabbim. And therefore, Shimon Levi need to teach us, no, in this case, when it comes to Erev, even if there's a Rabbim, ha'alocha k'divrei ha'mekel be'erev. And I saw the Dvar Shmuel, he says, why? Indeed, why when it comes to Erev do we say halacha k'divrei ha'mekel? So he says, there's a Taisus in Shabbos, Abezim and Aleph. He says, why does the Masechta begin with the Malach of Haitzah? There's so many other malachas, and actually it's not the first one on the list. So he says, Taisus says that Haitzah is something so common. And it can be stretched to Tchumen as well. It's such a common thing to carry and to walk. It's the most common thing that we encounter on Shabbos, more than all the other malachas, carrying and walking, carrying us in the courtyard, just a rabbim. And this is something so common. Therefore, Taisus says the Masechta begins with Haitzah. So we can apply here as well. When it comes to Tchumen, it says Dvar Shmuel, it's something which is so commonly done and can present many pitfalls. Therefore, when it comes to these halachas of Erev, the Chachamim saw it fit to apply coolness and leniencies, to be mekel on the olam, to make it easier. And this will eliminate and minimize the room for error and pitfall. So in any case, that was Rabbi Shimon Levi's Chiddush. We follow the lenient view, in this case Rabbi Yechim and Nuri, even though there's a Rabbim against him, because halacha k'divrei ha'mekel be'erev. Continues the Gemara. Amar of Maseches Eruvin. V'amar, some say it was Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak l'Rav. So they're also going to prove from elsewhere that even when it comes to din the Rabbanon, where Safek the Rabbanon l'Kula, we would favor a Rabbim over a Yachid. Ubed Rabbanon lo shani ben Yachid makim Yachid. So they're asking Rav, they're challenging him. Do you not agree that when it comes to the Rabbanon, even by the Rabbanon lo shani, there's no difference between Yachid makim Yachid? We have a Yachid who has a lenient view, and he's only being posed by another Yachid. There's no difference between that case, ben Yachid makim Rabbim, or when a Yachid who is being posed by a Rabbim. It certainly is. It's a big difference. Vatanya, haven't you learned in a Bryce? Shmua kroiva. If one received news that a close relative passed away, so the shmua, the news, arrived within close proximity to the passing. In that case, nehege shiva shleishim. As a result of this shmua, this news, he's meant to observe the halachas of shiva, halachas of shleishim. So shiva would apply to bathing, to laundering, and shleishim applying to haircuts. That's only because it's a shmua that came close. Ruchaika, but if it's a distant shmua, meaning he only received news when it was already far away, a long time has passed from the misa, in that case, it's only applied for one day. He doesn't observe the full shiva and shleishim. Vezi kroiva, what is considered to be a close shmua? Vezi rechaika, what is a distant? B'sayif shleishim, if he got the news within 30 days of the passing, kroiva, that is a din of a shmua kroiva, and the halachas of avelus apply. Apparently, because it's within 30 days, that's still within the realm of avelus, and therefore it's close enough to the death, and therefore the halachas apply fully. Lachar shleishim, but if it's already after 30 days pass, rechaika, that's called a shmua rechaika, and he only keeps one day. This it's irrelevant. Achashmua kroiva, achashmua rechaika, whether it's close or far. Nehege shiva shloishim, all the halachas apply. V'amar Rama Rachana Rabbi Yochanan. Which shita do we hold like? Now, the halachas of aval can have a d'oraisa application. As Tosis points out, the first day is avelis from d'oraisa, but the other halacha is only d'rabbanan. So which view do we adopt here? Which shita do we follow? Whenever we find, even by the Rabbanan, Yochid Mekel, Rab Machmirim, you have an individual shita who is Mekel, and you have the multitude, the Rabbim, which are opposing him, and they're Machmir. So even though it's a Rabbanan, we follow the Rabbim. Halacha, Kedivra Machmirim, Hamarubim. We follow the Rabbim, even if they're Machmir. Because a Rabbim carry weight. They're a true indicator of the correct approach. So that's a general formula. Chutz misu, except for this. Meaning, when it comes to halachas of avelus, of mourning, she'afa b'sha Rabbi Akiva mekel, even if we have Rabbi Akiva on the one side, who's being mekel? He says, well, if it's a shmua rechaika, he heard it only past 30, he doesn't have to keep it only keeps merely one day. So Rabbi Akiva is mekel, and we have the chachamim, who are rabbim, who are machmir. They say even if they're shmua rechaika, you must keep the full halachas of avelus. So even though we have the rabbim against him, halacha k'divrei Rabbi Akiva, we follow Rabbi Akiva's shita. Why? V'sav like Shmuel, he was like Shmuel, the Amar Shmuel, halacha k'divrei mekel be'avel. When it comes to avelus, we adopt a lenient approach. So the Shem Shmuel says the whole concept of avelus. The Gemara Moed Katan says a person is einay shalom, he's not complete, and he says the koichas of Rav Tuma rest on him. He says this whole concept became softened up, diminished as the generations proceeded. The koichas of Rav Tuma became less and less. He says the Chacham saw it fit to be mekel, to be lenient when it comes to these concepts of avelus. In any case, the Gemara here is stressing that generally when by the Rabbanan want to follow the Rabbim. There's an exception by avelus. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, by avelus huda akilu b'Rabbanan, it's only by avelus that the Rabbanan will mekel, despite the fact that there's a Rabbim who are machmir, aval ba'alma. But generally speaking, afilu with the Rabbanan, we learn from here that even when it comes to the Rabbanan, shani, there's a big difference between yochid makam yochid. We have a machlekes of a yochid opposing another yochid, in which case we're going to follow the lenient approach. Ben yochid makam rabbim, or when we have a case of a yachid who's being opposed by a rabbin, in which case we want to follow the rabbin, even by the rabbanan. So this was Rav Misharsha or Rav Nachman Yitzchak challenging Rava. You're questioning why Rabbi Shimon Levi needed to highlight the fact that we follow Rabbi Yochanan Nuri, even though he's being opposed by a rabbin. It said the rabbanan, what difference does it make if there's a rabbin against him or not? Here we have another raya that even by the rabbanan, yes, we're meant to follow the rabbin. It carries weight. It's a very significant factor. Even by the Rabbanon, want to follow the Rabbin. Yeah, we have exceptions. We have Avelis, we have Shas Adchak, or we have Eruv. But generally speaking, yeah, we want to follow the Rabbin. Therefore, I'm sure we need to highlight that by Eruv, we make that exception. Halacha K'divrei Mekel be'Eruv, even though he's a Yachid, a Neged Rav. Continues the Gemara. Back to the original question. Why did Rabbi Shimon ben Levi need to say, after he already said halacha k'divrei hamekel be'erev, we follow the lenient approach when it comes to erev, he need to add halacha is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Why did he see fit? Why did he need to add that? So Noah gave us one approach. We're going to have another two approaches. Rav Papa Amar Yitzrich. Yes, he needed to add that addition. Sagad Chamina, perhaps I can say, Hani mile be'eruv chatzeres. The general rule, halacha k'divrei hamekel, when it comes to erev, we're lenient. Perhaps that's only when it comes to erev chatzeres. Al be'eruv tchumen, emaloi. Perhaps there we won't follow the lenient approach. Someone will explain why. Tzricha. That's why. Yes, he needed to add that. Not only when it comes to erev, we are mekel. Even over here in our sugya, when it's discussing erev tchumen, we follow the lenient approach of Rabbi Yochanan Nuri, and the person who's asleep during Ben Hashmashos will acquire shvis. Says the Gemara, why would I think to differentiate? Why would I think to say the Shanilan bein Urvachatzeres and Ritchumen to split between one and the other? Why would I say that Ritchumen is different and perhaps we're not Mekel? The reason is as follows. The Snan, we learned in the Mishnah. Omar Abuda, Bamed Mamur. The Mishnah there is discussing the requirement to acquire consent, to receive permission from a person before establishing the Eruv on his behalf. You can't just do it without his knowledge. So the Rebbe says that's only specific to Eruv Tchumen. When is that said? Eruv Tchumen. Why? Because perhaps he's not really interested in going in this direction. He has a simcha, he needs to go in the other direction. He can't just place an Eruv on his behalf. Aval Beruv Chatzeres. When it comes to merely merging the residents of the courtyard to allow them to carry throughout the courtyard, there's no downside there. In that case, Ma'arvin bein ladas or bein shel ladas. You can make the Eruv on a person's behalf, whether it's ladas, he's aware of it, or even if he's unaware, shaloi ladas. Why? Shezachen la'adam shaloi b'fanav. Because one is allowed to do a schus for somebody, shaloi b'fanav, even without his awareness, without his knowledge. Ve'en chavan la'adam, but you can't do something which is detrimental to the person, ela b'fanav, only if he's aware of it. So, in sum total, we see that this Mishnah differentiates between Eruv Chatzeres, which is considered to be a schus, in contrast to Eruv Tchumen, which is not necessarily a schus. Perhaps it could be a chayva. Says the Maharal. That would explain why Rabbi Shimon Levi saw a need to stress that not only by Eruv Chatzeres do we follow the lenient view, even when it comes to Eruv Tchumen, perhaps there will be room to say, yeah, by Eruv Chatzeres, which is strictly schus, it's only beneficial to the person. That's why the Chacham said we follow the shita which is mekel, because it's beneficial to the person. It's a kula. It's a good thing. But perhaps when it comes to a tchum, which sometimes can be a chayiv, sometimes can be detrimental to the person, so perhaps there we wouldn't apply this formula that halacha kedibri ha-mekel be'erev. Why should we follow the lenient view? Perhaps it's actually going to be a chomer to this person. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon Levi needs to stress for us, no, even when it comes to Eruv Tchumen, even if it's not necessarily a schus, this is a klal which applies to Eruv in general, that we apply a kula, we follow the lenient view, such as in our case, we follow Rabbi Yechon's shita, that even a sleeping person acquires shvis. So this is Rav Papa's approach, that Rav Shimon Levi needs to stress, even when we discuss Eruv Tchumen, we adopt the lenient shita. Says more another teretz. Rav Ashi Amar, why did Rav Shimon Levi need to add that we follow Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri's shita, even though he already said that Allah Kedivra Mekel Be'erev? Itzrich, yes, it's necessary. Sagadai Tachamina, perhaps I would say, Hani Mili B'Shir Erev. We follow the Divrei HaMekel only when it's Shiur Erev, when it's a remnant of an Erev. Aval B'Tchilas Erev, Emaloi. But when we're initiating an Erev, perhaps there we wouldn't follow the lenient view. Explains the Ritva. Perhaps only when there was an Erev already established. You have a chazaka, you have a presumption that it's good. So perhaps we'll follow the lenient view when it comes to maintaining a pre-existing Erev. But in a case such as ours, where the question is, a person who's asleep during Ben Hashmashis, has a shvisa, has a tchum been established in the first place? That's called initiating an Erev. That's a tchilas Erev. So perhaps even if it's a D'Rabbanan, I'm not going to follow the lenient view. It's only to maintain, but not to initiate and create an Erev. So perhaps there I would say, Maloi. Perhaps there I wouldn't go ahead and follow the lenient view and establish and validate an Erev based on a lenient view like Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon Levi need to stress for us, no, we follow Rabbi Yechon ben Nuri even when it comes to validating, initiating an Erev. Umanat Heimra. Why would you say the Shanilon ben Shiur Elul Tchilas Erev? How do you know to differentiate between the remnants, the leftover of an Erev, or the initiation of an Erev? The Snan, as we find a similar concept in the Mishnah. Amar B'Yosi. The Mishnah there is giving us a share, the guidelines for the requirement, the share requirements, how much food needs to be used for the Erev. And the Mishnah gives us a large shir. Says Rabbi Yossi, when is this said? When do we require such a large amount of food to create that Erev? The Mishnah is there speaking about Erev Chatzeros, Shituf Mavois, let's say. Betchilas Erev. That's only when it comes to the establishment of the Erev. Aval B'Shiuri Erev. But let's say you already established the Erev, using the proper quantity of food, and then some food disappeared. You only have some leftovers. Afilu Kolshu. Even if there's only a drop left over, that's okay. Because it still retains its Erev status. Once you've established it, it remains intact, as long as there's something left over. The Mishnah concludes, the only reason the Chachamim required them to make it Erev Chatzeros after they've already established the Shituf Mavois, which is the partnership of all the alleyways together, which actually includes the Chatzeros within. So technically, you don't really need an additional Erev Chatzeros for the courtyard once you've already established that Shituf Mavois. And the reason why they required it, Elo Kadesh Loilu Shakeach, Teres Eruv Natinoikis, in order that the Tinoikis, the children within the courtyards, who don't necessarily see the Erev, they don't see the box of matzahs there, because it was only placed in one of the Chatzeros. Right? The Shituf Mavois is meant to merge together all the alleyways, only requires one box of matzahs, which is placed in one of the courtyards. So the other members, the kids which are roaming around the other courtyards, they don't see any Erev in the courtyard in which they reside. So perhaps they're going to forget about this whole concept of Erev. You see, look, everyone's carrying, where's the Erev? The Chacham required them to establish the Erev Chatzeros, despite the fact that there's already a Shituf Mavois present. Okay, this is discussed later on in the Masechta. In any case, we see in this Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi makes that distinction. He says, Tchilas Erev, when you initiate, establish the Erev, you require more food. When it's already been established, in order to maintain, you can even have a lesser volume of food. So you see that establishing is more stringent than maintenance. So likewise, perhaps, when it comes to following a lenient shita, perhaps that only applies when you're maintaining a pre-existing Erev. When it comes to establishing Erev, which requires more, perhaps we wouldn't follow a lenient view. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon Levi found it necessary to add that additional statement. No, we follow Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri even when it comes to acquiring shvisa, that a person who's asleep will acquire shvisa. So in summary, Rabbi Shimon Levi said halacha. He said two things: halacha kedibri hamekel be'erev, and he also said halacha kedibri ben Nuri. Why are both needed? Explains the Gemara. The statement halacha kedibri hamekel be'erev is teaching us that only when it comes to the kula do we follow the shita. Meaning, when it comes to a person who is sleeping ben hashmashes, we allow him to be kohen shvisa. However, when it comes to a kli, we don't follow Rabbi Yochanan, we follow the Rabbanan. That a kli hefker is not kohen shvisa. In which case, it's not restricted, it's not limited to 2,000. A person who picks it up can take it wherever he goes. Why did Rabbi Shimon Levi find it necessary to add a second statement? Halach kereichem en nuri? So you have three answers. Number one, even though Rabbi Yochanan is merely a yachid, being opposed by a rabbi, we follow Rabbi Yochanan. Even though we're speaking about Ruvet Tchumen, we follow Rabbi Yochanan. Even though we're speaking about Tchilas Erev, initiating the Erev, we follow Rabbi Yochanan. Continues the Gemara. Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Zrika Amru, they both dictated the following formula, meant to be applied when deciding matters of halacha. Halacha k'Rabbi Akiva mechaveru. The halacha follows Rabbi Akiva's shita whenever he has a machlekes with his colleague, with one other person. Rabbi Yossi mechaveirav. We follow Rabbi Yossi even when he's having machlekes with many others. Rabbi mechaveiroi. We follow Rabbi when he's going to have a machlekes with one other person. And the Marik points out that these formulas were adopted because the Chachamim not necessarily had the ability to delve into every single machlekes and shas, into the nuances and all the different aspects of the various opinions. Therefore, they adopted a general formula, which was based on the higher standing of one Tana over the other, or perhaps the superiority of his Rebbe over the other person's Rebbe. And that's why they adopted this formula. They assumed that the view which is being held by this shita is superior and preferred over the other shita. Says to what extent are we meant to apply this formula? Is it an absolute formula, or perhaps it's merely another factor to consider We prefer Rabbi Yossi, for instance. It's a factor to consider when actually coming to a conclusion, when deciding who to follow. So you have three opinions. Rabbi Asi Amar, halacha. It's an absolute halacha, meaning we publicize it. And even when it comes to Rabbi Yossi, who's having machlekes with many others, we're going to publicize the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Chia Ba'aba Amar, matan. We lean, we tilt. Rashi explains, he's referring to Rabbi Yossi when he's having a machlekes with many others. In that case, we can't publicize. Halacha is going to follow Rabbi Yossi. In contrast with the majority view, perhaps the point is we can't negate and undermine the view of the majority, which is a fundamental concept in Torah. Therefore, he says, matan, we lean, meaning we advocate it to an individual, but we don't publicize it. Rabbi Yossi Rechanina Amar, nirin. Again, he's referring to when there's a majority opposing, then nirin, it appears. What does that mean? Explains Rashi, so if a person actually followed the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, even though he was opposed by a majority, we don't make him overturn the halacha, he can leave it as is. Continues the Gemara. Kiloshen hazeh, according to the following formula, Amar Rav Yaakov Idi. Rav Yaakov Idi dictated the following formula. Amar Rav Yechanan, the name of Rav Yechanan. Now Taisus points out that he disagreed with the concept of following Rabbi Yossi even when he's being opposed by many. So that's the one aspect here, that he's disagreeing with the previous shita. So he had a different formula. Rav Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, whenever there's machlekes between these two, Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, halach Rabbi Yehuda. We follow Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, when there's machlekes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, halach Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi supersedes Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda takes preference over Rabbi Meir. That's how we get to the next point. If so, there's no need to say, when there's a machlekes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, halach Rabbi Yossi. Certainly follow Rabbi Yossi. Why? Simple math. Hashta b'makom Rabbi Yehuda. Lesser, because if in the face of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir is negated, b'makom Rabbi Yossi m'bayit, is there need to say that Rabbi Meir is negated when he's faced with Rabbi Yossi? If Rabbi Yossi supersedes Rabbi Yehuda, who supersedes Rabbi Meir, then certainly Rabbi Meir is negated in the face of Rabbi Yossi. Amar Basi, Afani Loimed, I too have the following conclusion. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, when I'm between these two, halach Rabbi Yossi. How do I know that? The Amar Abba, Amar Yechon. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, halach Rabbi Yehuda. Whenever there's machlekes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda takes precedence. We follow his shita. Now, hashta, Rabbi Yehuda lesson. Now that we see that Rabbi Shimon is negated in the face of Rabbi Yehuda, who supersedes him, but Rabbi Yossi, is there need to say that Rabbi Shimon will be negated in the face of Rabbi Yossi, who actually stands higher than Rabbi Yehuda? So on top of the pyramid we have Rabbi Yossi, followed by Rabbi Yehuda, and on the bottom we have Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. Now, between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, which one takes precedence? Iboilu. So I have the following question. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, mai. Which one between these two? Is it Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Shimon that's going to take precedence? Teku, we leave it unresolved. So in summary, according to this formula, the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi over Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda over Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, and certainly Rabbi Yossi takes precedence over Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. Regarding Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon themselves, we leave it unresolved. Continues the Gemara. Amar Mesharsha. I don't agree to all these formulas. Less no lahani kloli. We don't agree, we don't apply all these formulas. Rather, we evaluate each situation on its own. We take a look at the opinions, at the shittas, and conclude accordingly. We don't apply these general formulas. It says to him, how do he know that's the case? This nan, is it from the following Mishnah? This is our Mishnah, Lamad of Adayma. We're speaking there about the people stuck out in the wilderness, and they have their 4 amas, and they share a portion of their 4 amas, and Rav Shimon added, this is similar to the following scenario. We have 3 courtyards lined up side by side. So they're open to each other, and they're also open to Shusarabim. The 2 outer ones, so we have A, B, and C. Now the 2 outer ones, A and C, made an Erev with the middle one, with B. He muteris imaim. So B can transfer to them. They can transfer to it because they have an erev. Ushtan chatzonis asuri zumzu. The two outer ones at the extreme cannot transfer one to the other because they have no erev. So this is the shita of Rav Shimon, and Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says all three are asur is going to be discussed later on. V'amar Rav Chama bar Guria, Amar Rav, halachak Rav Shimon. We follow Rav Shimon, and we say that they're mutter to interact with each other. Uman Palgalei, who is the man Amar who disagrees? Rabbi Yehuda. Because Rabbi Yehuda is the one mentioned earlier in that Mishnah. So apparently he's the one who disagrees with Rabbi Shimon. So how can you say halacha follows Rabbi Shimon? Well, Amrit, haven't you said? You applied a formula. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, halacha Rabbi Yehuda. El Alav, apparently Shema Mina. We hear from this. Less new. We don't hold to those formulas. We see clearly that here we paskin that halacha like Rabbi Shimon, even when he's opposed by Rabbi Yehuda. Says, "Oh my kusha." Well, what's the kasha here? Dilma heicha de itma. Whenever there was an explicit conclusion, fine, we follow that conclusion, such as in this case, where we have a statement of Rav Chama bar Guria, the name of Rav. In this case, we follow Rav Shimon. Fine, it's an exception. Heicha lo yitma, but otherwise, when it wasn't said and concluded, then we went to apply those formulas. So we don't have a kasha from this case. Elamaha. How did Rashashi know that we're not meant to apply those formulas? From the following Mishnah. The Snan, Irshal Yachad Vas Shal Rabim. We have a city that belonged to a Yachad. That means, Rashi explains that there were no 600,000 people milling throughout the city. And then it got populated with Nasa Shal Rabim. Many people arrived, and now there are 600,000 people. It looks like a Rosh Hashanah. Marvin and Skula, you can still go ahead and make an Erev throughout the entire city, Erev Chatzeres, we're speaking about a walled city, which will allow carrying throughout the entire city. However, Shal Rabim, let's say originally it was a populated city, you had 600,000 people using it, but now it's a Shal Yach, and then slowed down, population thinned out, and it no longer appears like a Rosh Hashanah. It doesn't have those 600,000 people, which make it look like Rosh Hashanah. Still, Ein Ma'arvin Eskula. You cannot make an Erev throughout the entire city, unless you leave something out of the Erev zone. Ela im kain oisa chutzala, you leave some portion out of the Erev area, where you won't be able to carry. How large a portion must that be? Kiyusha chadosha sheba Yehuda. It needs to be equal in size to the city Chadosha, that was the name of the city. But Yehuda, in the area of Yehuda and Israel, how large was it? Sheyesh ba chamishim diyurin, which contained 50 residents. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. What's the point here? The point is that it should be a hacker. We have to implement some type of recognition here, so that people shouldn't forget about the whole concept of Shisarabim. This place, this city, initially began as a public area, a place with Shishim Ribu, looks like a Shisarabim. So even if the population thinned out, and now you no longer have a Shishim Ribu, 600,000 here, it doesn't appear like Shisarabim, still, you cannot go ahead and arrange to carry throughout the entire city so that people won't forget about the concept that you're not meant to carry in Shisarabim. So you're meant to leave some portion where you can carry. So how large? A size equal to the Ir Chadasha, which had 50 diyurim. Divrei Shimon Omer, you don't need to have it so big. Sholosh Chatzeres, Shol Shnei Batim. You need to have 3 courtyards with 2 houses in each. That's sufficient. This sugya will be discussed later in Daf Tes. In any case, who do we follow? V'amar Rav Chama bar Guria amar Rav, halachak Reb Shimon. So we follow Reb Shimon despite the fact that he's opposed by Rabbi Yehuda. Uman Palagalei, Rabbi Yehuda. Who is opposing Rabbi Yehuda? V'amris, haven't you said Rabbi Yehuda, Reb Shimon, halachak Rabbi Yehuda? When these two having machlekes, Rabbi Yehuda and Shimon were found to follow Rabbi Yehuda. So this is inconsistent with your formula. Says, my kushya. Here as well. What's the kasha? Dilma hachanami. Here as well we could answer. Hey, chad itmar. When there's an explicit statement, such as in this case, Rav Chama bar Guria says, "No, Rabbi, follow Reb Shimon." So it's an exception. Hey, chad itmar. We learned. Hey, itmar. But otherwise, if we don't have a clear-cut conclusion, lo itmar, then we don't have a conclusion. Meaning, we want to follow those formulas. So how do you have a right from here that those formulas are not meant to be applied? The more we proceed to bringing more rayas, as we're going to see Be'ez Hashem in the coming daf. Okay, time for a brief review of today's daf. The more began that Rabbi Yeshua and Levi made two statements. First of all, we follow the shita of Mekel when it comes to an error. Follow a lenient view. The more tells us that the implication here is that on the one hand we follow Rabbi Yechim and Nuri. So if a person was sleeping ben hashmashes, he's granted a shvisa. That's a kula. On the other hand, we follow the Rabbanan, that a kli hefker doesn't have shvisa, which results in a kula, and a person who picks it up can take it wherever he goes. Rav Shlomo Levi made another statement. The halacha follows Rabbi Yechim and Nuri. And a person who is asleep in hashmashes acquires shvisa. The Gemara wanted to know why it was necessary to add this statement on top of the previous one. The Gemara gave us three approaches. Number one, the chiddush was, even though he's a yachid, being opposed by a rabbin, we follow his opinion. Second approach was, even though he's speaking about Eruva Tchumen, which sometimes result in a chayva, sometimes it's a detriment of a person. Nevertheless, we follow the lenient approach. Third approach in the Gemara was, although we're speaking about a tchilas erev, the establishment, the initiation of an erev, in this case as well, we follow Rabbi Yochanan Rishita, and a person that's asleep in hashmashes, he acquires shvisa, acquires a tchum. The Gemara concluded with several formulas regarding the conclusions of halachas pertaining to various machlekes, and then we'll proceed to discuss whether or not we want to apply those formulas.